In banking, finance in general, a core thing is identity. Who is it you're talking to? Are they really working honestly? Are they part of a gang? Those sorts of things are the bedrock. That's why banks have, big fancy buildings and big steel doors on the vaults. In the digital age, of course, that means doing things over the internet, communicating things digitally, online, and the question of identity and security becomes very, very different. Now, when the internet was originally invented, they didn't think about identity or security because it was just the gang of guys who were doing it. They were all going to be in the university or in the military, and they weren't doing anything terribly valuable, so no one worried about it, and there was no mechanism that was set up. As a consequence, we've sort of gotten along with things like passwords and sending things to your cell phone to check that it really is you, and frankly, it's just not very good. And when you think about security, the news is all about cybersecurity and how people are breaking into anything you can imagine, stealing records, leaking them. It's a disaster. The bad news is it's going to get a lot worse because the bad guys have sort of figured out that you can make a lot of money this way, you can be anywhere in the world and do it, and they're getting better and better and better. Instead of things being okay to sort of patch along and hope that'll happen, we have to do things very differently, and we have to do it pretty soon. So that's why identity, security, authentication, know your customer, anti-money laundering have become such important topics. How are we going to do this? It's not passwords, it's not the traditional ways with paper. We have to think about how do you do this from a cell phone in a rural area that's maybe not the richest area? How do you do it from a city in a country that has, let's call it an aggressive government, and yet make it secure, know who you're dealing with, and something that's secure enough to give people the trust they need to be able to have a financial system and use it. Just used a couple of terms: identity, authentication, know your customer, anti-money laundering, trust. What do those mean? Well, identity is how you prove who you are, and not just who you are, but the whole history of transactions, capital, other sorts of things that you have. It's not just your name, not just your body, it's also a lot of the relationships that you have. Do you owe a lot of money? Do you have a lot of money? Are you representative for a company? You need to know more than just who it is. You need to know what do they bring to the party, right? Are they going to be a potential investor? Do they have a long record of crime? Are they really broke but happen to be wearing a nice suit at the moment? Those are the sort of questions that come along with identity, authentication, and knowing your customer. Anti-money laundering refers to attempts to get rid of organized crime or crime in the financial system, and money laundering is just the prime example. People taking cash, turning it into credit that no longer has an association with the crime. Traditionally, this has been done by looking for unusual transactions, but of course in the digital age, you can make thousands of small transactions from thousands of virtual places instead of walking in with a suitcase full of cash. So how are you going to detect what's unusual? There, anti-money laundering has to do with asking not just, is this an unusual transaction, but how does this transaction connect to all the other ones? So for instance, if all of a sudden there's a bunch of transactions which are the same in terms of amount or when they started, even if they come from different addresses, even if they look like they're slightly different, it's the coincidence of them all happening in some same place or some same amount that might tip you off. And actually, it's networks of interactions you have to look at. You say, well, these guys come from where and deal with who? And if it turns out they all deal with the same people, then they could be colluding. So anti-money laundering needs to get a lot more sophisticated in the digital age, where it's looking at networks of interactions, not just the interactions themselves. So two more things that need to be defined are security and privacy. So security in the old days meant, a big vault, lots of reserve capital. Today it's more complicated because you have things that are held in databases in lots of different countries potentially. You have not only the bad guys going after it, but countries. So National Security Agency of all these different countries going after it. It turns out that the only thing that we know to keep that sort of thing secure is certain sorts of technologies known as encryption, being able to keep things in this sort of shuffled way that you can't read. And in fact, you have to be able to keep it encrypted all the time. The moment you decrypt it, it's a target. And that's why people are really interested in some exotic technologies, homomorphic encryption, secure multi-party encryption, and blockchain, which is a way to make a ledger that is secure even if you have employees or bad guys on the inside that are trying to take you down. So security is a huge area that we will talk about. The other one is privacy, because again, it used to be that you could go sort of late in the evening to the bank and they would promise not to tell anybody that you were there, so you could have your dealings in private. But now governments are worried about that because of money laundering and other sorts of organized crime. And of course, online, if you can tap into things, the privacy goes away really fast and spreads everywhere. So we need to think, really, what do you mean by privacy? And the first answer is encryption. Make it so that nobody can read the stuff. But then that's something that the bad guys can use to be able to do transactions and avoid getting caught. So there's this tension between security and privacy that we somehow have to resolve.